Welcome again to A Night for Truth, a series of conversations with Dr. Alice von Hildebrand on the work of her husband Dietrich von Hildebrand, and we have been speaking in this series of conversations most notably of his massive work, Transformation in Christ. And we have just been talking to each other here, and it has been very much a question of a hop, skip, and a jump across the surface. If you were able to get hold of a copy of the book for yourself, you would see what I mean when I say that essentially every line, certainly every paragraph, can be unpacked or opens out in virtually all directions. You find your innermost being under a very, very punctilious scrutiny, and yet always charitable. Dietrich von Hildebrand is a rigorous teacher, but he is always charitable. He's a loving teacher, I would say. You never feel lashed, and yet you are aware that you are scrutinized by what is truth. That's really, I think, the as they say now, the bottom line. You are confronted with the naked truth of the matter. We've been talking about this question of true freedom, human freedom. What is it to be free? The obvious popular notion abroad, not just in this epoch, but in almost every century, the notion of freedom has been, let me get the gods off my back, or let me get free of the rules or customs or the establishment, they used to say in the 1960s, and I can be free. And of course, a Catholic has an altogether different understanding of the nature of true freedom. What does it mean to be free in Christ? It has been said, of course, that freedom is not so much the right to do what I want, but the power to do what I ought. And this is certainly the light in which Dietrich von Hildebrand speaks of this tremendous topic of freedom. Well, Dr. von Hildebrand, where did we get in our last time together?
You know,
where are we going?
One thing is obvious. It's a religious approach. The non-religious person will have great difficulties understanding that all the things we've been discussing are actually obstacles to a religious development. Yes. I mean, when they're going to say, why make so much fuss about things that seem to be so insignificant? You know, as I said, they're small little traits. They seem to be very insignificant, and nevertheless, they prevent my expressing love, my giving love, and they also prevent me from being truly free in the truth.
You know, this is interesting, just parenthetically, a parallel to a great deal of what your husband says shows up in one or two of the works of C.S. Lewis. During the Second World War, he was criticized when the Screwtape Letters came out, which was supposedly a bunch of letters from an older devil to a younger devil on how to wreck the faith of a young Christian. And people would write to Lewis and say, how can you be writing this pettifogging stuff when the bombs are dropping and Europe is in flames and so on? And Lewis's point was, but it is from these very things that happens. What was Hitler doing when he was 12 and 13 and 14? He wasn't attending to these things, and you only get Auschwitz or you only get Coventry in England as the fruit of this sort of thing. And I think by sitting under your husband's tutelage, people will find
well, I mean, just realize something very important. For example, we live in a society where the news media have such power over us that they sort of determine our thinking. And, you know, this is called today to be politically correct. This is what you're supposed to say, this is what you're supposed to do, and if you don't do it, you're sort of eliminated or rejected. You see, there is such a thing as public opinion. You know, whether it is valid or invalid, whether it is blown up by the news media, whether invented by the news media, it's a very powerful reality. This is what public opinion says. Public opinion does not favor abortion, but is against abolishing abortion. You know, meaning to say that a woman has a right to be free. And then you realize that lots of people don't dare oppose it, because public opinion is such a powerful mountain, and you don't oppose it. Otherwise, immediately you're going to feel that you're pushed aside, you're eliminated, you're considered to be non-serious because you don't agree with what public opinion says. Now, public opinion is an intellectual monster, and there's absolutely no reason to submit of it. You take the case of Hitler, you take the case of Nazism. There was a moment in Germany when public opinion declared we need a change. You know, things are going so very badly, and there we have a leader who is going to lead us to freedom and to reestablish the grandeur of Germany. And then if you opposed it, all of a sudden you were a bad citizen and you were this and this and this and this, and most people don't dare oppose it. Now, this is a tremendous lack of freedom that leads to tyranny, because the very moment that tyranny raises its ugly head, we have to oppose it. And if we wait, all of a sudden we find out that we find ourselves in a society where our freedom has been taken away. And this is a constant danger. So, I mean, I recall something interesting which happened, let me see, it was in the spring of 1946. And I recall that at Manhattanville College, Sacred Heart, when I got my BA, there was going to be an international conference, a big conference, about the relationship between Eastern democracy and Western democracy. Eastern democracy, meaning to say Russia, who was at that moment the gallant ally of the United States, and that we were repumping and rebuilding, you know, and so on and so on. We are victorious. And then Western democracies. Now, to speak about Eastern democracies was such a lie. And the theme of the conference was the importance of philosophy to create these bonds between Western democracies and Eastern democracies. You cannot imagine the theme of the lectures that were praising the greatness of Eastern democracies, and finally Eastern Europe was going to be liberated from monarchies and from tradition and so on and so on. And nobody said a word except my husband. And he raised his hand, and with a strong, clear voice, he said, "Now look, we have conquered Nazism, but have no illusion. Communism is just as bad. They have a different name, they have a different color, but basically it is the same atheism, the same hatred of trans, the same totalitarianism, the same abuse of human freedom, and so on and so on." Well, he was booed.
Really?
He was, and, well, that was one thing. And then, interesting enough, after the talk, one of the professors at Fordham, he was a professor of history, and he said, "Dear professor, I agreed so well with what you said, and you formulated so powerfully, and didn't feel that it was necessary to take your side." Well, in other words, he had not dare raise his voice, but when my husband saw, so he thought, same thing when he gave a talk in the Midwest. And he was giving a series of talks and went to Catholic colleges and started thundering against the danger of communism. Don't forget, it was a honeymoon relationship between the United States and Soviet Russia. And my husband saw that the whole of Eastern Europe was being taken, and they were going to be, the church was going to be persecuted, the priests were going to be murdered, and so on and so on. And he raised his voice, and a nun, of all things, raised her voice and said, "How dare you compare these gallant Russians to these dirty Nazis?" Just to show you, these people were imprisoned by public opinion because, the newspaper had been so clever at propagating your communist ideas. And don't forget, Al-Jahis was in the government, and he was a powerful influence, and so on. And the Charter of the United Nations was based upon the acknowledgement that Russia, communist Russia, was a great country that deserved to be developed, and so on. People don't dare oppose it.
It reminds me of the maxim that is in William Butler Yeats' poem. Is it The Second Coming, or which one is it? where he says, the worst are full of a passionate intensity, and the best lack all conviction. And I've often thought that it's the sort of squashy, warm matrix of the sort of liberalism that has no absolutes. That's the matrix in which totalitarianism or radicalism grows. It has to have that soft, squashy matrix that you get in the academic world.
And in fact, you know, what they tell you is, I read an article recently saying, if you defend absolutes, you open the way or the door to totalitarianism. It is the very opposite. It is only these absolutes that make you free, because they give sense and meaning to life. But I mean, just to show you the danger is so tremendous, because today 90% of Americans are going to make up their minds about things according to the news media. And the news media are just going to give us one slanted view of reality, number one. And then number two, it's always going to be in the sense, beware of absolute truth. People are going to impose their ideas upon you and so forth and so on. Yeah. You see, so it's a very, very dangerous trend that we are facing today. And this is something that it has sense. And from this point of view, the reading of this particular chapter is something which is so liberating, because it shows you this is what you have to do to remain free or to liberate yourself from these illegitimate influences. But I mean, of course, what is interesting is that you find people who believe that change is the key to greatness. And Plato wrote in his last word, the Laws, any change which is not to eliminate an evil is an evil. You know, meaning to say that tradition is something which is so powerful and so helpful. It gives you a sort of framework to your existence.
But
you know, the wisdom
now.
The wisdom of the past that we cannot simply reject unless we discover that actually they have made mistakes. And there, of course, you're going to find people who believe change is the key to everything. That was one of the slogans of Nazism. You know, change. Change for the sake of change. Finally, new doors open and so on and so on. But you find the other side. And the side is the wrong conservatism. And you know, and therefore, unfortunately, what people do is always to set the wrong alternatives. Either you change everything or you change nothing. And then people say, you know, you're too far right or you're too far left and so on and so on. And my husband said, truth is not between two errors. You take a little bit of conservative and you take a little bit of the changing mentality, and then you gather it. He says, no, truth is over and above it. It's over or it's deeper. So, I mean, if you were to say to my husband, should we go right or should we go left? You see, the Christian attitude is go deeper and find a supernatural answer. And of course, you all know people that are conservative by temperament. And any change, even if it is a desirable change, is something that they're going to reject because it's new, because they're not used to it. St. Paul says, test all things and keep what is good. And some changes are called for. I mean, for example, you know, they can be changed in social security, or they can be changed in... I do not know, but I simply say there are certain political changes that are desirable because they open the way to a greater freedom in the good sense of the term. But there are changes that are deplorable. And therefore the question is always to test it. And some people have a sort of constipation. They do not want to change anything because it has always been done so. You know, just before the shows I was telling you the rather lovely story of this maid that my husband's family had in Florence for 50 years. And there was no icebox. You know, it was an very old 16th century convent. And
I should tell the viewers that an icebox is a refrigerator. I grew up with ice boxes. And
well, I'm sorry. Well, I apologize.
I still call it an ice box, I'm afraid.
Well, I do too.
In any event.
You know, and I don't feel I'm changing, but I mean,
no,
you know, if it is absolutely crucial, I will do it for the sake of the public. But at any rate, my husband's niece, who was renting the place to rich Americans, and of course, when they saw there was no refrigerator, they said, well, you know, of course we need one. So she told the maid, and she said, you know, Juliette, are we going to have a refrigerator? And she said, and she had tears in her eyes, and she said, but Mrs. Peplow, but my mother never had one.
Yeah. It's like saying my grandfather never had any running water, therefore I don't want any.
Well, nevertheless, people wanted to wash themselves and they were clean. I mean, you see, it's perfectly false to believe that you need all these conveniences. Well, I mean, at any rate, some people have the danger of saying, well, I don't want any change at all. And I grant you that, unfortunately, many changes are for the worse. But some changes are good. For example, I mean, in medicine, there's no doubt about it that today we know certain things that we didn't know before. I mean, I have an artificial knee. Well, I mean, it's an enormous change in medicine, but this would have been impossible 50 years ago, and I would have been a cripple. So I simply say the question is this holy freedom to change what deserves to be changed and to keep what should not be changed.
Now, this is a guess on my part because I didn't know your husband personally, and I'm trying to think of I'm not sure I could rake up a proof text here, but I don't want to load the question, but I guess I'll have to. I would suspect that your husband would be one of the ones who would look with a certain amount of distrust on someone's reading only contemporary stuff, only the news, only the newspapers, and listening only to television, because of course that is just talk about surfing. I mean, it's just nothing but an avalanche or a mudslide of change. And if there's no pole or plumb line there against which to test change, then you don't know where you are. I try to avoid as much as I can of political, presidential races, and luckily I was out of the country during this last one, so I didn't have to.
But I hope that you prayed.
Indeed, yes. But I didn't feel as though I had to read trillions and trillions of words about the whole thing. And it seems to me that the bondage, one form of the bondage to public opinion or political correctness or contemporaneity is this absorbing and soaking up of the what is churned out in the press from the pundits and the columnists and so on, which gives me no perspective at all on the whole thing from, for example, from the moral point of view, from the eternal point of view, from the Christian point of view.
There's something very tragic. The food that most people get today is exclusively television and newspaper, meaning to say that they feed themselves on spiritual junk food. And then, of course, they're starving. You see, I mean, very much as very many Americans are obese because they feed on junk food. The percentage of obese people in the United States is, I believe, 30%. It's absolutely amazing. You don't see that in Europe because they eat good food. And so I say, spiritually speaking, we're doing the very same thing. Because newspapers and, of course, are very good magazines, but as in television, usually they just give you the most superficial and the most limited and the most narrow-minded possible view of things, you see. And so I find it so incredibly tragic that man made to God's image and likeness, made to enjoy God forever in heaven, is feeding himself on this junk. And in order to liberate myself, I should limit myself to what is absolutely necessary to know what's going on in the world. Kierkegaard, who was so incredibly witty, wrote something that I often like to quote, and he hated journalists. So he always considered them to be simply a plague. And so he wrote, it's almost a quote. He said, if my daughter became a prostitute, I'll never give up hope that she'll find her way back. But if my son became a journalist and remained one for 3 years, I give him up as lost.
That sounds...
meaning to say that
Kierkegaardian boldness.
They are not concerned about what is true. They are concerned about what is selling. So often they publish things which are in no way true or valid or confirmed simply because they have to go to press. You're given 1 hour or 2 hours to write an article, and it was Muggeridge who was a journalist for many years, and he said that one day one man came out of a hat, and all of a sudden he became famous, and they had to write an article about him. And so in an article saying that he had a devotion to great music. and afterwards he found out that he was tone deaf. But he had to be practical, you see. So another obstacle to freedom is habit. You know, it is interesting to make a distinction between what is valid in habit and what is invalid.
I was going to ask you that very question.
Well, you know, because
habit can be a gloriously liberating and enabling thing, or it can be a dreadful birdcage.
I mean, you know, this is precisely what he has developed so admirably. And let me just catch it very briefly, because we're always running out of time. Suppose that you learn how to drive a car. You've never driven a car before, and it's a shift car. And of course, I'm not going to trust you as long as you have not developed the habit. You know, because if you say to yourself, what should I shift now? And what gear am I on? You know, I don't want to be sitting next to you because you're going to, you know, to hit a tree or something of the sort. Finally, you drive well when you drive automatically. That just becomes second nature, and you no longer think of what you have to do, but you do it. You know, it's a habit. Same thing if you're a great cook. You know, for me, I mean, to cook is such a problem, and I break my head. What I have to do next? But a great cook does so and so and so, because she's done it so often, she's developed this habit. There are good habits. For example, to go to bed at the same time every evening and to get up and sing.
And to pray at certain hours.
Well, yes, and you know, let us see the structure of my prayer life that I go to. But as soon as something has a spiritual content, habit can become something very dangerous.
Deadening.
For the very plain reason that I do it by habit, and I no longer am truly in living contact with what I'm doing. If I go to Mass every day, I've been going to Mass ever since I was a teenager. And if I go by habit, of course, in the morning I go to Mass. It's one other thing on my calendar, and then you cross it out. Instead of understanding every day is such an overwhelming. You get up in the morning and you say, no, I'm privileged to meet my God. I'm privileged to adore Him. I'm privileged to receive Him, the body of Christ in Holy Communion. Every day it should be something new. What is the curse of many marriages? Habit. Instead of understanding every single time you embrace the beloved, it should be a totally new thing. It's not just a repetition of what you've done so many times. You know, and therefore, in my spiritual life, in my intellectual life, habit can be deadly. And we have to shake ourselves from the power of habit. What is good is a framework, you know, that, of course, you simply take for granted every single day you're going to devote a certain time to prayer. But the content of your prayer cannot simply be a repetition of what you have done before. It must be new every single time.
It must be right at this point that habit and discipline come together, or put it the other way, that you can see a distinction between habit and discipline, namely, I have to follow, in order to keep my daily prayers going and make them an integral part of the fabric of my daily life, there has to be a certain amount of discipline.
Yes.
But if that slides or declines into mere rote or mere habit, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, I think that the Rosary would be a very good example of that. You know, you can rattle the whole thing off, and your mind can have been thinking about 500 other things. The discipline of including this in your day is the good thing, whereas I suppose the mere habit, which becomes a bondage, can be a deadening.
You know, this is what, look, in habit, you see, what is habit? You can distinguish between two things. One of them is that you do things with ease.
Yeah.
You know, when you have done something very, very many times, it becomes easy. When
like
you do it for the first time,
it
becomes easy because you've done it so many times. But the second, and this is what is so dangerous, you can do so with a minimal of consciousness and attention. I left my apartment on Saturday to fly down to Alabama. Now, if you were to say to me, my goodness, did I lock my door? And I have no recollection of doing it. But as I have locked my door millions of times, I assume that automatically I locked my door. But I mean, all of a sudden you can say, I have no recollection whatever of locking my door. You see, no, cannot happen in spiritual life. What is true is that because you've done it so often, you know, and you have the discipline, you have the structure, then it becomes easier.
Yeah.
You know, it's some sort of a deep longing of your soul to talk to God and to relate to Him. But if it becomes automatic, and therefore you do so with a minimum of consciousness, as you say to pray the rosary, and you're rattling and so on and so on, then you say, well, I can cross it on my list, it's one of my obligations, and I can cross it off. Every single time it must be a sursum corda, it must be something new, I must emerge from, you know, let us say, the routine
sort
of my daily life.
Yeah.
And
well, we have once again reached altogether too soon the concluding minute of our time together, but I do think what you've just been saying is touches very closely on one of the central strong points, I think, of all your husband's writing, is that it draws one to the reality of the interior, of the interiority of the thing, and what is it that separates an authentic discipline from a mere rote habit. And it's the reality of the interiority of the thing. Well, thank you for joining us once more on A Night for Truth, Conversations with Dr. Alice von Hildebrand. I'm Tom Howard, and we will welcome you again, we hope, to further consideration of the work of Dietrich von Hildebrand.